Good morrow, students. It's time for part 2 of our discussion of theater since Seneca and London theaters in the Renaissance. So now we're going to move into the context of theater performance in Shakespeare's day, and in some ways Shakespeare's role in even defining what theater performance looked like during the Renaissance and the Reformation. So let's dive right in, shall we? Alright, so a little bit of backstory. Up until 1575, actors were forbidden to perform within city limits in England. And so what was very typical were for traveling acting troupes to show up at a city, much like they had been doing in medieval times, much like they did in the Roman times before permanent theaters were constructed. And they would set up semi-permanent structures on the outskirts of town. They were wooden. Most of them were semicircular. They would have a stage and kind of like a stage building as we become familiar with, but they would set up their benches in kind of this semicircular way. They would do their performances and then they would leave. Performances and theater, were just one of the many, many, many ways that Elizabethans were able to spend their time and spend their money. And similar to the Romans, right? Theater was just one of multiple different sorts of entertainment that was available. So ancient Elizabethans, they weren't that ancient compared to the Romans, but we'll just say Elizabethans, so called because they were living under the reign of Queen Elizabeth, the daughter of Henry VIII. They could go see something like animal fights, bear baiting. They could see sports. They could gamble. They could see boat races. If you lived in London, you were right on the Thames River. They also could watch the Queen. So the royalty had become kind of their own form of entertainment. There were all kinds of drugs and alcohol available. So opium was freely available from trade with the East. There was just a lot that was kind of demanding the attention of Elizabethan people with disposable income. And so theater was actually pretty affordable, especially when it was on the outskirts of town. Now, eventually, a man named James Burbage had a vision of creating the theater, or a permanent structure within the area of London, within the city limits, that would allow him to produce many, many, many more productions than if he was just basically, managing a traveling stage troupe on the outskirts of town. And so what he created was a theater that was basically a big wooden circle, freestanding, wasn't built into the side of a mountain or anything like that. There was both a ground area where people could stand to watch the play and galleries where they could sit. The stage would actually jut out into the crowd where the groundlings, the people who were watching on the ground, were set up. And this model became incredibly popular. So by 1600, there are 6 theaters on the outskirts of London, right? So each theater could hold up to about 3,000 spectators, quite big. And we know from studies that close to 20,000 Londoners were in theaters at any given time. All right, so if all 6 of these theaters were putting on shows, they could accommodate close to 20,000 of them. And that's about 20% of London's population at the time. So this was an incredibly, incredibly popular and relatively affordable form of entertainment for Londoners. So who is doing the acting? So, as we saw with the medieval theater, most of these companies were traveling troupes, right, who all worked together. They had a patron of sorts, and they would put together a repertoire of plays that they would all feel comfortable performing. As was the case in antiquity, all of these actors were male. So that means that men were cross-dressing to play female roles. But there was no longer a chorus. So there was no longer a need for singers and dancers in the same way that there was for Greek plays or Roman plays. So all of the actors who were on stage had sort of a character that they were playing, and most likely a speaking role of some kind. The different troupes had different patrons. So Shakespeare's troupe was originally called the Chamberlain's Men, right, the Lord Chamberlain's Men. He was their patron, and he was the one who put up the money for them to continue to do their activity. And eventually they became the King's Men, right? So they came under very different patronage and had a little bit more money and had a little bit more wherewithal to do some things. So again, let's look at some fantastic images from ancient manuscripts because they are just so fun. We have an image of a traveling acting troupe who would be moving around from city to city, setting up their impermanent, kind of temporary performance spaces on the outskirts of town, or moving into the more permanent theaters that were around the outskirts of town and setting up a residence for a little while before they moved on elsewhere. The Swan Theatre was one of the 6 theatres that were on the outskirts of London, and this is our earliest known sketch of that theatre. So this is one of our primary texts that we use to help us understand these performance spaces. So you can see that our stage building, right, had 2 doors in the front, had a gallery on the stage building itself. It was held up by some columns. There was a big stage that jutted out into the circular area, which is where all of the people who had ground seats, they were called the groundlings, where they were able to sit. And then behind them, you can see these different galleries where the seats would have been. And this would have been a circular theater, so these galleries would have stretched all the way around in a large circle. So what we see here is a cross-section of the Globe Theatre. Now, the Globe Theatre was the theater that was built by Shakespeare's performance company, the Chamberlain's Men. And you can see with a little bit more detail how intricate this really was and how complex of a building it really was. So, for example, you can see here in the stage down here a little trap door. So this was meant to be a means to descend into hell. And up on the portico, this sort of supported roof by the columns, this was meant to be heaven. So you can see how it was painted with these stars and these different ways to represent divinity. So that's kind of a holdover from the medieval area. Again, you can see where the groundlings would have stood in these 3 different galleries where wealthier patrons would have been able to sit. But notice how close the groundlings could get to the performance space. So that's something that the orchestra in Greek and Roman theater would have prevented, right? The chorus would have been down here singing and dancing. But in Renaissance times, there was no chorus. Everybody was up on stage. So the audience could get much closer and have a much more intimate experience. So the Globe Theatre has been recreated by an American actor, and I'll point you to a documentary for you to watch. But this is in the picture of the modern Globe Theatre looking down into the stage. You can see the groundlings and you can see where the people in the galleries would be seated. And they do put on productions at night. Thankfully, electricity has made many things possible that weren't possible before. So you can see that it is wired for electric light, not completely authentic, but pretty spectacular nonetheless. Okay, so later on, James Burbage, who, really was the visionary behind those original permanent theaters, also wanted to find a way to make sure that theater could happen in the off season. So obviously this is a warm weather entertainment. If you're outdoors, if it's open, it's under the sky, it has to be during warm weather. So he had this idea to create an indoor theater that he eventually started working on that he called Blackfriars. So it was a space that was carved out for him, and I'll show you a picture in a moment where theater troupes could act inside, and you could have a similar sort of seating gallery as you would to outdoors. Now, the theaters began to be forced to be closed around 1642, and this was in response to a couple of different issues. One was plague, so not unlike now, there was a need for social distancing, and theaters and other places where people were collecting together became very dangerous from a public health perspective. Over times, there had also been theater closings because of the material that was being staged. Right, there were people who thought that plays offered immoral and loose entertainment and that they weren't appropriate for Londoners to be experiencing. So again, we could probably relate to some of that censorship in different forms of our own entertainment. But honestly, the biggest concern was the spread of disease. But here's a picture of what Blackfriars would have looked like. So again, we have this really interesting stage where instead of the people being on the ground floor here, where there were some, many of them were actually seated here in these galleries, right on the side of the stage. So there was much, much more intimacy. These doors would have been built in as the stage building, and the action would have taken place on this front area. But just the vantage points and the viewpoints were so different. And you can see these hanging chandeliers of candles, a new state-of-the-art lighting system in Renaissance. Now there happens to be a replica of Blackfriars in, I think it's called Stanton, Virginia, where the American Shakespeare Center is located. So you can get a sense, just looking at some of the people who are seated here, how closely they would have been involved in the action. And you can see the two-tiered separation on the stage itself that they also would have enjoyed inside Blackfriars. Okay, so we've come to our end here. Just a quick note that Shakespeare himself, again, was a member of Chamberlain's Men. I'm going to go back for a second. And the Chamberlain's Men were the ones who essentially financed the creation of the Globe Theatre. So the Globe was created specifically for Shakespeare's acting troupe, and this is where most of his plays were originally put on. Later on, when they became the King's Men, they were able to move into Blackfriars as well, so they then had an indoor space. Now, I mentioned in 1642 that the theaters were beginning to close for different reasons. Shakespeare died not too long after the Globe actually burned to the ground, so his career was quite brief, but it was rather brilliant, and he had some really incredible spaces in which to stage his plays. All right, I hope you all have a wonderful evening. I bid you good e'en, and I will talk to you again very soon.